All right, welcome back to another episode of Modern Cyber. As usual, I am your host, Jeremy with Firetail, and I am here today with Terry Ziemniak. Terry, I'm delighted that you'll take the time to join us today. Terry brings over 25 years experience in information security with work ranging from technical, compliance, and executive leadership. His recent positions include 10 years as information security officer for multi-billion-dollar organizations across the U.S. Terry now works as a fractional cybersecurity executive, helping SMBs understand, manage, and reduce their cyber risks. We're going to definitely talk about what SMBs need to be thinking about currently in the current cyber landscape. Terry's a partner at TechCXO, where he works as an interim and fractional chief information security officer. We're also going to talk about the role of the fractional CISO in the modern landscape. Recent engagements include working with the data analytics firm, an AI-driven targeted advertising company, as well as traditional furniture manufacturer looking to modernize their tech and security stack. Prior to that, Terry worked in more traditional full-time CISO roles in several large organizations. Terry has a Master's of Science in Information System Security, and presented his master's project tying AI and cybersecurity together at an academic conference in Germany. That's another thing I really want to learn more about as we go through today's conversation. Terry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber.
It's a pleasure, Jeremy.
Well, just to start off, I'd like to kind of just understand a lot. There's a lot in your background there about having had, various roles with large organizations. In your own words, what's been your journey? What's brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, so my career journey really has three phases. The first phase right out of college was very technical, so bits and bytes. Over that first decade or so, I got a very broad experience on a whole lot of technology. So I went to school, college, computer science, just writing code like you learned back in the early 90s. But early on in my career, I was building computers, networking devices, databases, all this sorts of cool stuff. And that broad but not particularly deep served me well because a consulting company I was working for was building a cybersecurity program. They said, hey, we need security guys or guys and gals. What does a security person look like? Back then, you had to be good at a lot of things. Not necessarily great at any one, but good at a lot. So if you wanted to, scan servers, detect the vulnerability, exploit it, write code to do something, those were things that I could do, and I could chain together. Again, being good at a lot of things served me well in the cybersecurity space. So that was really kind of the first part of my career. And when I was working with a security consulting company, one of the salespersons came over and said, hey, we got someone ask about HIPAA. What's HIPAA? And we're like, oh, geez, I don't know. So we're all looking around. What's HIPAA? I'm like, I don't know. I'll go figure it out. So I guess this was before Google. So I threw in there into Yahoo or something like that and searched for HIPAA regulations and printed out the 200 plus pages of regulations that I read through it. I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool stuff. So that segued me to the second part of my career, which compliance and then leadership roles. So that's really marked by me learning how to do more of the business side of cybersecurity. In that time, I worked at 3 different large healthcare organizations as their CISO. At the time when the CISO role was really evolving, it really didn't know what it was. We didn't know what it meant. Frankly, I didn't have much, I didn't have mentors in the sense there aren't a lot of people in the cybersecurity leadership space at that time. It was all new. We're all kind of learning on the fly. But it was great. Got to learn a lot. Again, it was more the business part of cybersecurity than the technology. One of my roles, as a matter of fact, I wasn't even in the IT organization. I was in a legal organization, but I was the CISO. So that's the second part of my career. And then the current phase, maybe the last, maybe not, it's left some time to go, but my current phase is consulting. Yeah. So what I'm doing is I'm working as what's called a fractional CISO. And what I do is I provide the executive leadership in the cybersecurity space for organizations, really kind of tying them together in that the business leadership, the compliance, the risks, with enough technical acumen that I can make all the pieces work together. And that's where I'm currently at.
And when you go into customer organizations in this kind of fractional role, what's typically the first thing that gets discussed or that you end up looking at?
I tell you, pretty much all my engagements always start with the question of, why are we here? Why do you want to be secure? And it's kind of interesting because that's always conversation with business leaders, not the techie teams.
Yeah.
And I've had some, people say, well, I just feel like I have to be more secure. I had one woman who's really smart executive I've been working with for a long time. She says, well, we got to do the right thing. We got to protect the data, but I also want it to be a business differentiator for us. That's the kind of thing you'd love to hear from your leadership group. But more and more, Jeremy, what I'm hearing is this is becoming an obstruction for sales. If you're a mid-sized company and you're selling into a bank, to the government, to the military, to healthcare, to whoever, these buyers have all of these cybersecurity concerns to what they consider third-party risk. So if they're buying a widget or your service or your staff or whatever, how do the big guys know that you're not introducing cybersecurity risk to them? So that really has been a big driver for my business over the past 5 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, one of the things you said earlier was that part of what got you started on this journey was looking at HIPAA for the first time. And under HIPAA, as you know well better than I do, you've got this concept of a BAA, a business associate and a business associated agreement, where you might have downstream vendors that support your organization. And in a way, they kind of inherit the HIPAA requirements almost, even if they themselves aren't handling data that is in scope for HIPAA. It can be a risk to your HIPAA ratings or your HIPAA kind of compliance and ongoing certification if you've got these kind of gaps. And I've been telling people for a while that, part of it, just to take a sidetrack for a sec, we as a small organization, we did our SOC 2 early on, and we're in the process of doing our ISO 27001 right now. And I tell people, a big part of why we do that is so customers can have trust to, let their data sit with us. And I see that this is the direction that pretty much all of it is going. HIPAA may have been the first to kind of set this standard for, hey, we've got a business relationship as partners. You serve us in some vendor capacity for something. But I think it's becoming prevalent, and I think it's kind of going everywhere. I generally view it as a good thing, but I guess this is a big part of what you're seeing with the organizations you're working with as well, right?
Yeah, it really is, because but a large number of the breaches and security incidents you're seeing for big companies are not the big companies themselves. It's their partners. So just historically, it's always been the partners beyond, even if, one of the more famous breaches that Target had about 20 years ago, and the one that really opened everyone's eyes to what's going on in cybersecurity. Target was breached. The bad guys got on their credit card swipes during about 20 years ago. That breach actually came because someone hacked their HVAC maintenance company.
Yeah.
So they got into their heating and cooling company, and that got them into Target, and there was a huge breach and a huge issue. So, I think that's also where we take it, Jeremy, to the idea that this is a differentiator. If you're selling widgets or services or whatever, and if you can lead with the cybersecurity discussion, hey, there's 3 people sell what I do, but I got my SOC 2, I've got my ISO, I've got whatever. Right. Those are conversations that may well be a differentiator for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you had that first conversation. You talk about why we're here. You talk about, hey, is it because we want to view it as a sales differentiator? We want to do it because we just feel like we might not be as secure as we need to be. I would hate for anybody to be doing this, either because A, they don't know why, or B, because they've gotten breached. One thing that I tend to see is we tend to see a lot of, I've worked on the cyber vendor side for a little while now, and what we tend to see is it's not us who got breached, it's one of our competitors who got breached, and that often is a trigger for organizations to go out there and look at it. But once you've gotten past that initial, what's the impetus for the conversation, where do you then look? Is it kind of a, okay, let's assess where we're at? Is it kind of a, let's set the goals for the outcome? How does that typically play out?
Well, so that's where I transition, and I focus on why I'm here. They bring me in as a fractional CISO. They're not bringing me in to do an assessment necessarily, or a particular task or a deliverable. I'm really engaging as a cybersecurity executive for the company that works 1 day a week effectively. So as an executive, with my experience doing this is about, if I was there full time, this is what I would do. I would assess. I would establish a roadmap. I would communicate the roadmap, get buy-in to the roadmap, budgeting, whatever else we need to do, and then I execute the roadmap. And then I do the same thing every year. So roadmap, execute, roadmap, execute. That's what an executive, whether it's a CFO or a COO or a CMO, it's what they all do. It's the same exact concept. Typically, though, I do have I start with a true assessment where I align with NIST or some other kind of standards-based assessment to kind of figure out where they're at, because it helps facilitate the conversation for the roadmap itself. So we can have conversations. If you have gaps here, You should be here. This is red. This is green. So that first communication of conversation on the roadmap, it helps to have some kind of framework or standards to align us. Because the other question really, Jeremy, is how secure do you have to be?
Yeah.
Do you want to be Fort Knox? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah.
That's a very expensive journey. It may not be necessary to be Fort Knox. Maybe you just want to be very good, or maybe you can afford being just good. There's different levels. So it's really important as an executive. Again, you need that roadmap, you need the buy-in, but to make that happen, you need to have the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the themes of over the 50 plus episodes that we've done here on Modern Cyber. One of the themes that's always come up, well, two kind of related topics that always come up are, one is security is never done because the organizations don't sit still. You're never kind of locking in, okay, we use these systems, they never change, et cetera. That's never the case with anybody. And the second is that there's no such thing as being done implementing, or being done looking at managing all of your risk. And it's always a question of like, what is the risk tolerance that the organization is willing to have? You're never kind of guaranteed to be fully secure against every threat. New threats come out all the time. Organizations adopt new technologies, all of that. So I really understand and kind of empathize with that. I do wonder, like, with the organizations that you're working with, let's say, smaller organizations. Do you find that they really have that understanding of like, this is a risk and trade-off kind of conversation from the very beginning? Or do you kind of have to educate them on that?
That's an excellent question. And that's something that I learned on my personal journey as an independent consultant, which is where I started about 5 or 6 years ago, trying to sell this concept that, hey, I'm a cyber executive. Let me help you with your issues. So I did the training classes and I talked to other people that were successful to kind of figure out how I'm going to sell and how I'm going to market what I do. And I really honed in the idea that this is a risk that we're dealing with. And if you have a business leader that understands risks, not necessarily cyber risk, it could be financial risk, competitive risk, regulatory risk. If they understand those concepts, that there's something that we need to address that we're never going to correct, but we have to manage and we have to tolerate risk, then I can work with them. If I have people that just don't get risk, and there's business leaders like that, they just don't get those concepts of there's a gray area. You're never going to fix this problem. You have to be good enough. You have to have secondary controls. You have to have backups, everything else. If these people just want to buy a widget, if I buy a widget, I'm secure. Those are a very hard sell, either selling solutions or just discussing this problem, because that's been the historical problem with cybersecurity over the past 25 years. If the leadership thinks you can just buy 5 or 6 widgets and be done, you've got a communication, you have a leadership issue. And I mentioned a couple times, it's communicating with the organization is a key part of what I deliver as an executive or a part-time executive. That culture and leading and teaching leadership is important. But you're spot on, Jeremy. This is a risk conversation. And if you get to that point, you're halfway there.
And so along those lines, when you sit down with, let's say, the leaders of these organizations, and you talk about, what is the right level of risk for them, or what is quote unquote secure enough for them, do you find that you end up kind of needing to bring your knowledge and background and your experience up to that point to that conversation?
Yeah, 2 things. One is I can facilitate the conversation because I've had the conversation 100 times.
Right.
But yeah, it is that's kind of the magic of, my experience being in the executive suite for such a long time. Because I've heard those conversations. Again, on the regulatory side, I've heard HR people have the conversation, finance. So I had that conversation and participated many times. Actually, one of the large organizations I was at, they had kind of pockets of risk, and I partnered with the finance folks and the insurance folks and the cyber sharks, and we started normalizing the risk conversations.
Okay.
So that, I learned a lot doing that because leadership already knew about financial risk and they knew about the insurance risk because this is a healthcare organization.
Yeah.
And then I brought in cyber. So the 3 of us started talking the same language, using the same metrics. So we leveraged the risk knowledge that was already within the organization. But big organizations can do it, small ones can't. But you need to teach. Part of leadership is teaching. You got to teach about risk and what that means.
Well, I guess one of the next questions I would have along those lines is, as you're thinking about these smaller organizations, so you come in, you have this conversation, you maybe establish, okay, why we're here, you establish what some of the desired outcome goals are for the whole engagement. When you think about kind of, okay, you've set the direction, you've kind of defined a timeline for various activities to take place and to then take the next measurement point and kind of check on the progress of the program. One of the challenges I've observed with smaller organizations is that they often, don't have the skills to get this done in-house. So how does that end up playing out? Does that end up being kind of a partnership with somebody like a managed detection and response provider? Or does that end up being, an MSSP or some fractional implementation folks? How does that typically, take shape nowadays?
Yeah. So again, putting my hat back on that I'm an executive, but I only work 1 day a week. I've got a roadmap, and we all agree where we're headed. Part of that roadmap has to be resource allocation. So most companies have perhaps desktop support in-house. They have development staff in-house.
Right.
They may or may not have a SOC in-house. They probably don't have penetration testers. They probably don't have SOC 2 analysts. They don't have policy people, whatever it may be. So once you agree on the roadmap, then you start having conversations of resources, and you pull the resources from, you've already got them in-house. We already have partners. I bring my own toolbox of partners. So if they need a pen testing company, for example, I can certainly make some referrals for that. My company, TechCXO, one of the reasons I joined the company is I have staff available to me. So I've got SOC 2 analysts that I've worked with on a couple engagements, so I can bring those in. So once you have the roadmap, you find the right resource based on the company. If they all have it in-house, great. If not, you find the right cost-effective resource to get the job done.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So ideally over that time period, what would you say? Like, do you think most of these organizations are able to make significant progress over the course of 6 months, or is it more like a year, 2 years?
Yes, there's low-hanging fruit that most companies have, so there are some things you could check off. A common one for smaller companies is they're using Google or they're using Microsoft Office online. Yeah, like, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the Google guidance on, how to configure Workspace. And we're going to do it simple about it. There's like 15 things. We're just going to go through them one at a time. Microsoft Office. So yeah, there is low-hanging fruit. Multi-factor authentication is generally pretty well distributed, but not everywhere. Simple audits, user access audits will flush out a lot. So it almost runs like a spike. You have low-hanging fruit, you knock a bunch out. Then you got maybe the unsexy policies and auditing stuff.
Yeah.
They start doing more of the technology stuff because I'm a big proponent of a well-written policy. Well-written meaning small, digestible, actionable sorts of comments, because a well-written policy, then it becomes empowering. Hey, development staff, we have our rules on writing code correctly. Go do your job. You have directions now. Hey, desktop support people, we've agreed XYZ. Here it is. You're empowered. Go do your work. So well-written policy, frankly, allows you to get more out of your staff because there's clarity and agreement, and you can get measurements out of that pretty strict, pretty easy to track measurements and metrics and KPIs if you do them correctly.
Yeah. That it's funny. I kind of laughed as you started giving that answer, because it so matches a lot of my experiences in the cloud security space. And typically what we would find with customers who are implementing a cloud security program and typically based on our tooling that we had at the time, the company that I was at, it was very much this initial spike of, oh crap, there's all these things we didn't know about. And then there's the obvious glaring things like, oh shoot, this database is exposed to the internet, this set of files, whatever it is that was inadvertently exposed. That was the number one, by the way. I mean, across those two resource types, that was really the number one that would come out of those things. Then it would be things like, oh, we've got, a shadow admin, or we've got an IAM policy that gives everybody admin privileges. You knock out some of those low-hanging fruit very quickly. And then it really does set into kind of, well, what some people would call the slog of going through real policy assessment as you go through it, but which I'm sure you can relate to, but it's so batches. And I kind of feel like it's probably the same with almost any security program. You really identify. Yeah, go ahead.
If I could distill that even more, Jeremy, it really comes down to most companies don't know their stuff.
Yeah.
You can't protect your stuff unless you know what it is and where it is. And that means
always starts
people,
visibility,
devices, data, contracts, partners. Everybody struggles inventorying their stuff. And that is a universal problem everywhere.
It's funny. It's one of two problems that I feel like has been around in cybersecurity for like as long as I've been doing it. So the 27-ish years or so that I've been in the IT world, from my time, which by the way, my experience kind of mirrors yours in the sense that my first half of my career was really hands-on keyboard slash, racking in a data center type of experience. And I have the cuts and the scars on my hands to show the experience from those Rittal 19-inch racks that I'm sure we're all too familiar with. But, that kind of the two things that I've seen consistently is we struggle to maintain inventory and visibility. And number two is we struggle to patch. And I'm just like devastated by the fact that patching statistic hasn't changed, that it's been, 6 months to from the time of identification of a CVE to the time of patching in most enterprises. And that has been the case for like 20 years. And I really wonder, from your perspective, any feedback on why that's the case?
It's hard. Well, it's gonna be a lot of things. I'll tell you my background. I was 20 years ago at Sears Corporate, so Sears and Kmart right after they merged, which was a cultural train wreck.
Yeah,
I was Sears, the company's merged. I was in charge of vulnerability management, so I was the patching guy for all of Sears and Kmart. It was 2,000 stores all across the world. It was a nightmare. They were like 14 months behind on their patches in some cases. But it was just a variety of little nickel and dime problems. They had small stores that had like ISDN, if you guys remember what that was. It's fancy modem. They didn't have time to download the patches across the wires. There was political issues. They couldn't get approval to do stuff. It's technology issues. We're afraid something's going to break, so we don't want to do anything. So the way I handle that is I just went pure visibility mode. It's like, hey, we're doing, I can't fix all your problems, and we're going to start making sure everyone knows what's going on here. And when you had the visibility, then leadership would support you because it became less of a nebulous, we don't know what's going on. And hey, let me show you all the red issues all across the organization. And we made a lot of progress, but it was politics because we couldn't get approval from certain people. It was processes, we couldn't get sign-offs and the testing wasn't working correctly. We couldn't get test groups. We didn't have, some of the tools we needed. So it really was not a technology issue. And it's rarely a technology issue in patching. It's just organizational will and someone to just keep raising the flag and keep beating on that drum. But I think in the cloud, it is easier. It can be done, but it's still, I think, the problem, Jeremy, of where's all of our stuff. It's easy to patch 98%.
Yep.
It's easy
to not last 2%.
That could take you forever. Yeah.
Yeah. It's whether it's 80, 20, 98, 2%, whatever, but it is very often getting that first chunk done is pretty easy. Do you find that with the organizations that you work with, if they could look across, whether it's, let's say, like multi-factor, patching, whatever, if they could go across each of those like key categories for the different types of risks that they might have as an organization, and they could knock out that 80, 90%, whatever it is, do you feel like they'd have better results? Just stop there. Just accept that you're not going to be able to get that last 2 to 20% done. Do you feel like that would, drive positive outcomes?
Oh, I absolutely, because the majority of the attacks that are happening are unknown exploits. Yeah. So it's rarely a 0-day issue. It's rarely China targeting you and attacking you. It's people exploiting known issues. So if you can go be really good at a lot of stuff, that's where you want, again, really good at a lot of stuff as opposed to perfect at any one. If you're perfect at multi-factor or your identity and authentication, it doesn't help. And if your backups are screwed, it does you good. So go be good at a lot of things.
Yeah.
The basic. Sorry? I'm sorry, leverage that framework. So as I mentioned, my assessments start with a framework. The framework tells you where you should be looking. So NIST CSF is a great one to start with. There's, dozens of categories there. Go be pretty good at all of them before you try to be great at any one. I think that's a fantastic point.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. If we in our own lab where we test APIs, when we stand up APIs, a couple things happen. Number one is they all start getting traffic typically within 3 to 5 minutes, sometimes even quicker than that. And these are, unpromoted, no DNS name, random IP address provisioned by one of the cloud providers that we use to stand up our testing labs, et cetera. So this is, some random IP address gets traffic very, very quickly. And what we see with the traffic is, well, there's one thing that we definitely see as we're talking now in kind of early 2025, is that the traffic is a lot smarter than it used to be. So it used to be that we would just get, kind of spray and pray, stupid kind of like script kiddie, let me just test a bunch of idiotic things. Now we see a little bit more educated and more informed follow-up requests. Oh, okay, we got a response from something. It looks like it's running Python on the server side because an initial request that we issued tried to kind of discover the tech stack of that API. Now we're seeing a little bit smarter. But to the point that we just discussed, it's still only somewhat smarter. It's still going to be the lazy attacks, saying, okay, now I know you're Python. Let me check Python CVEs. Are you doing something with a compromised PyPy package that I know about and a CVE that's embedded in that through some supply chain mischief or whatnot? So, getting good at those basics, I think you can kind of avoid a lot of the lazy attackers with automation. And I always remind people, hackers have automation too, and theirs might be just as good as yours, if not better.
I agree. There's not a lot of surprises out there. Things are evolving and changing, but if you think about the bell curve, deal with the stuff in the middle of the curve. The fringe, until you get good at the big stuff, don't worry about the fringe stuff.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I want to pivot and talk about a couple of other things, and I'm curious about one thing, which is, how when you talk to these organizations, right? There's let's call it the CIA triangle that I'm sure you've seen multiple times. You talk about cybersecurity and you talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? And okay, security generally is very good at those first two in terms of, let's say, the confidentiality and somewhat the integrity of systems, networks, identities, etc. But availability is something that I do know that small businesses historically have struggled with. When you have an attack, you always see these headlines of such and such company is completely offline, down right now, systems down, not accepting orders, whatever. You can, insert the kind of message there. How do you see the connection between, let's say, the security activities and the programs that you engage with customers on and resilience and availability and uptime?
Well, I will let me inject one thing first. So take your conversation, your question back to the third party risk. Again, if you're selling to a bank, a hospital, or the government, for example, and you get knocked offline, that's a big risk. You're not breached, but DOS or there's a fire and you're offline. A lot of the outages we're seeing in 2024 and 2025 are tied to service providers and partners of the big guys going offline. So that is absolutely a threat that you need to worry about and your customer needs to worry about. So yeah, availability is a big deal. Availability, if you use a proper framework like the ISO or SOC 2 to a degree covers it, your NIST, you will be covering those topics. So those that fail in the availability are probably those in the bucket that aren't worried about being, again, be good at a lot of things before you try to be great at anything. So it's frankly, lack of vision if they're not thinking about their availability. None of these things are particularly complicated. That most of the engineers out there, they know how to solve these availability issues. But the question is it on the roadmap? Does leadership aware of it? Are they willing to pay the money to make it happen? And again, if you align it with a framework and you have the right conversations, those are not difficult to sell. Because again, we're going to spend, we assume we can stop 99% of the hacks. We assume we can stop 99% of the ransomware attacks, 99% of the phishing attacks. Some are going to get through. Will our business survive in that case? And one of the hot topics the past couple of years, Jeremy, in the cyberspace has been business resiliency. Yeah, it's exactly that concept of we're going to try to stop the bad stuff from happening, but if it does, how does our business survive? And that requires a lot of non-technical skills. It's your business impact analysis. What do we really do? What's important to us? What's important to our contractors or our clients, to our employees? If you can't make payroll, you're going to go out of business real quick. So be aware of what's necessary to make the business function.
Yeah. And along those lines, when you talk to leaders about that, I guess kind of going back to one of the first questions that we had in this conversation, which, to these SMB leaders, do they understand the value of resilience? Just similar to how we asked, do they understand security? Do they understand the value of resilience and what resilience really means for them?
No, they don't.
Okay.
It's a difficult concept because it's more risk-based concept, but you can couch it in different terms than resiliency. So, um, if you work through the conversation of, hey, we're putting this stuff in place with what we're willing to put in from resources and business disruption and technology, and we're going to be 99% covered in things we're worried about. What do we do about the 1%? And then have that conversation. And business resiliency doesn't have to be terribly expensive if done well. Maybe there's only 3 business processes that are really important. And what do you do about those 3 processes? And maybe you just go as far as the mental exercise of what do we do if it's down? Maybe you don't want to spend $1 million on secondary technology to support XYZ, which may frankly have the same cyber risks that your primary infrastructure has. Maybe you don't want to build all that out, but you want to go through the business risk conversation of, if we can no longer produce our widget because our, I don't know, Active Directory servers are offline or our infrastructure is out, what are we going to do? Who are we going to call? Are we getting insurance online? Do we have partners we can deal with? So it can be paper exercises and paper tabletop sorts of efforts. You can get a lot of value, but if you're shocked and surprised, day one you have nothing, you're really going to be in a pickle.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting to hear, and great lesson learned for me and for our audience. I want to pivot the conversation with the last topic that we have time for today, and I want to hear more about your thesis, about what led you to write it, what led you to present it at an academic conference in Germany. Did you do that in German? Just love to hear more about that story.
Yeah, so I completed my master's degree, 12 years ago, maybe, in DePaul University in Chicago. And it was a degree in information systems security, a master's degree. And it was really neat stuff. So I was pretty well into my career. I knew a lot of what was going on. And I enjoyed graduate school much more than undergrad because I knew the basics. And I knew what they meant. I knew the value of it. So I got a lot more out of the classes than I ever did in the undergrad space. They took a couple classes in artificial intelligence, which I also took way back in undergrad. And I'm like, boy, this is really cool stuff. It's kind of the basics you see these days, but it's like the assembly version. If today AI is at PyCon, I was dealing it at the assembler level, very low level sorts of stuff that we were doing. But we were building neural network engines, we're building all sorts of neat things. And while we're building it, one of the things we worked on is using a neural network and decision tree sorts of logic to do grouping. And I said, boy, this is really neat. What if I took our logs out of our application and grouped people? What would that look like? So I was working in a healthcare organization. I scrubbed all the data, obviously, but I had millions of transactions. Dr. Jeremy did this. Nurse Terry did that. Receptionist Susie did this. Threw it all in there, and I mapped them all together. I said, we're gonna map these people together. And I had a good mathematical model of what what doctors look like. So doctors, on average, across the million transactions, printed 7 times in a day. They logged in 14 times. They saw 6 patients, whatever it be. So the transaction would map them up. Now with that, I could say I could well map doctors, but Dr. Jeremy doesn't look like the rest of his peers. Why is that? So what I would do is then I can find the outliers. Basically, it was mathematically mapping who does not act like their peers, and that was just the way. It was really neat. A lot of neat things. I was able to find people sharing credentials that otherwise would not have popped up on the radar. I also was able to tell I could map the hospitals based on how recently they had their new medical records application installed, because well-trained people act the same. After 5 years, everyone's habits start deviating, so the training drifts and they're all doing different things. So
interesting.
Very well.
So if you look at the entire sample size, once you start to see drift outside of a certain band, then you know that it's been in place for a little while and people start to develop some of these unique habits. They forget some of that training, or they realize, is it more that they forget some of the training, or is it that they learn how to kind of bend the system for different workflows, or some of both, or what do you think?
I think it's the latter. So they're all doing, but you don't have prescriptive statements of these are the 13 clicks to accomplish a task. You have generally where you work when people start, they find their own shortcuts and their tweaks and whatever else they want to get their stuff done.
Yeah.
So anyway, I did that. I wrote the paper for it, and I submitted it to IEEE to just to get it published. And after I did that, I'm like, well, why not? And I started sending out to the conferences to see if I can present. And Stuttgart University in Germany said, yeah, we'd love to have you. I'm like, what? Surprising anybody said yes. I'm like, sure. So made a presentation based on that, flew out to Germany, and really neat experience. So it was the CIO of Stuttgart University was facilitating the whole thing. He ended up taking the speakers, Jeremy, out to dinner the night before the conference. He takes us, this is a German guy, he takes us to a Chinese restaurant in downtown Stuttgart, and we had a scotch tasting event. It was like just total cacophony, and with all these and the guy knew how to play the bagpipes. So he's playing the bagpipes, this German dude, in a kilt while we're drinking scotch. It was just surreal dinner, but it was neat. Learn a lot about scotch. The next day I ended up giving the presentation. It went well. But the interesting thing is I gave my pitch, went through it, it was polite applause at the end. And after the presentations, typically there's 3 or 4 questions, kind of follow up. I got nothing. So I gave the presentation, just sat there quiet, nothing. And finally some guy raises his hand and back. And keep in mind what we're talking about is all the activity at the medical record application. And then we kind of group people together. The question is, do people know you're watching what they're doing?
Yeah.
And it's just, it took me a while to kind of click what he's talking about. Like, do they know we're watching the logs? I'm like, why wouldn't we? And I talked to the guy after the presentation. He's like, we're Germans. Like, we don't let the government look at anything, and no one gets to look at. So just the cultural disconnect of why would you even want to do that? What was really a lesson learned, and it opened my eyes to that. It just never occurred to me.
Yeah. I've lived in a couple of countries overseas and spent some time working in other countries, and exactly that point about what the different standards and norms are in country to country relative to things like data collection, privacy, what have you. I lived in Singapore for a number of years, and one of the weirdest, for me as somebody who's spent most of my life in the US, one of the weirdest things is that, there's one login for every government system. And once you have that one login, you use it for your tax, you use it for your for your health insurance, you use it for your retirement funds, you use it for Social Security, you use it for everything. Everything related to the government comes down to that single login. We use it for our visa renewals, things like that. And here, it's just a mess. Everything that you do across, when I log into the IRS, I log into, I don't know that I even have a login for individually for many other government organizations, but, I've got a login for 100 different things. And then similarly, a lot of my family comes from Finland. I've spent years living over there. It's your bank account login that you use to log into any number of services, from the bank to the post office to health insurance, et cetera. So seeing these little cultural differences and system differences is very interesting. I'm really awesome to hear about that experience. I personally applaud you for going through it. I think it's really fascinating to get off the beaten path. And I actually think it's something that we as cyber people should be getting out to non-cyber communities. So I tend to think that we kind of we do our research in a bubble. We talk in a bubble. We have our conferences that are very much a cyber bubble. And even if you go on LinkedIn, I'm sure your LinkedIn feed is very much like mine, where what I'm going to see when I check it from time to time is a bunch of cyber stories and not really too much exposure to outside or other things.
Yeah, because you got to think, why are we doing cyber? Cyber is there to support the business. Cyber doesn't exist, I don't know, in and of itself. It's there to support the business.
That's right.
Business has mission statements. Do you know your business's mission statement?
Yeah.
Things like that. That's why we're all here.
I think that's a great point to close conversation on. It's not cyber for cyber's sake. It's cyber to support the business, to provide security, to provide resilience, all the other things we've talked about on today's episode. Terry, thank you so much for taking the time. For people who want to learn more about you, about your work, maybe they want to find that paper, where's the best place for them to go look?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn or my company website. So I, as a fractional executive, I work for a consulting company called TechCXO. So we're a collection of fractional executives, COOs, CEOs, CMOs, and a couple security guys as well. So you can look me up there. I assume in the show notes we'll have those links, Jer.
We'll have both of those linked. For in all of our audience. Well, Terry Ziemniak, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber. To our audience, please rate, review, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. You know what to do. Also, if you know somebody who would like to come on the show, please have them reach out. We've got a couple of guest slots open in the months to come. We'd love to learn more about new topics, new areas in the cyberspace. And for now, thank you so much. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.